This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I have a question for Madam Flanagan Whalen. Thank you for taking the time to testify. You mentioned several times that the Government of Canada calls on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law. In other words, the laws of armed conflict. In light of this, do you assess that any of the parties in this war, in other words, Hamas, the IDF, and others, have violated international humanitarian law?
I'm not in a position to make that judgment. We are watching a fast-moving situation on the ground. We are encouraging all parties to do what they need to do under international humanitarian law, to respect the laws of conflict, and to ensure the protection of civilians.
Thank you. Is the Government of Canada calling for a ceasefire?
The Government of Canada has not called for a ceasefire specifically. The Government of Canada has encouraged parties to the conflict to follow their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure humanitarian access, particularly into Gaza, given the desperate conditions there.
Thank you. The government has stated that the State of Israel has the right to defend itself within the laws of armed conflict. Does the government accept that a state's right to defend itself includes a state's right to prosecute the war at a pace and time of its choosing? In other words, to decide when the military action will begin, when it will end, and if there will be a ceasefire?
We have indicated that the government of Israel needs to abide by the rules of war and international law. Those are questions that need to be responded to. There are questions around military strategy that the government of Israel will take on itself, but will be closely watched, we're certain, from outside. And we will remind Israel as well that there needs to be a day after in this. There needs to be a plan for what comes next. Because what we want is to get on the path to a sustainable peace here. And we need to think about what the day after looks like.
The government accepts that the right to defend, a state party's right to defend itself under the laws of armed conflict include a state party's right to prosecute a war, to begin a war, to end a war within the parameters of international humanitarian law, in other words, the laws of armed conflict, at the pace and time of its choosing. Does the government accept that that is included in the inherent right under Article 51, I believe it is, of the UN Charter and within the parameters of international humanitarian law?
We have been emphasizing those parameters of international humanitarian law and international law. So, that is what we've been saying, that they must act within those parameters that are established.
Thank you. The Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that the explosion at the Gaza hospital was illegal. In other words, contra international law. What did the Government of Canada mean by that? I'm sorry,
I'm not aware of that statement, but I do know that there is a statement.
She said very publicly on Twitter, on X, that the explosion at the Gaza hospital was illegal. What did the Government of Canada mean by that?
So the Government of Canada's most recent statement on this, which came out on Saturday from the Canadian Forces and the National Defence, indicated that the assessment that we have made with a high degree of certainty indicates that this came from the Palestinian side.
Yes. It's the statement, I believe, said that it was a result of a rocket fired within Gaza, which would imply that it was fired by a terrorist group within Gaza. That, combined with the word illegal, would suggest that the Government of Canada has assessed that the rocket firing was deliberate and not proportionate. That's what, logically, those two statements combined would lead one to conclude. So that's why I ask, what did the Government of Canada mean when it said that the explosion at the Gaza hospital was illegal?
The events are moving very quickly, and it's important for us to be able to step back and take a pause
Agreed.
look at the evidence.
But I'm wondering, in light of that, if the department or the minister will issue a clarification to her assertion that the explosion at the Gaza hospital was illegal.
I think that the statement that was released on Saturday indicates where we believe happened with a high degree of certainty based on the intelligence that we've seen, based on our analysis of the blast zone, based on what we can see. I think this is the most definitive statement that we've made at this point about what we think happened there. And I think that this needs to be taken right now as the most definitive explanation of where the government.
Well, I think there's a great deal of confusion because of the earlier statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple questions about some of your testimony in your opening remarks. I note that you said in your opening remarks that Hamas has killed more than 1,300 Israelis, and we know where that data comes from. It comes from the Israel Defense Forces and the State of Israel. Later on in your opening remarks, you said, quote, "There are reports of 4,000 killed," end quote, in reference to Palestinian civilians in Gaza that have been killed. Where do these reports come from?
There are a variety of different sources for the reports of Palestinian deaths. Those include the local Ministry of Health, but also include non-government organizations and international organizations.
Does the department treat with the same veracity reports from the State of Israel and the Israel Defense Forces compared with reports from the Ministry of Health in Gaza?
There's been a greater consistency in the reporting from Israel. We trust the reporting from Israel. There's been a wide range of figures that have been asserted on the Palestinian side. That makes it a lot harder for us to be able to judge what the precise numbers would be. But a life is a life is a life. And we certainly are concerned about the suffering that has occurred on the Palestinian side. We know that there are deaths that are occurring, evidently. It's a little bit harder to get an exact picture of the precise numbers, though, because we do have this range that is put out there. Yeah. We recognize as well that there is an information war that is going on, and that the numbers that are being put out can often include that element of making a point publicly.
But does the department acknowledge that there's a difference between information provided by a liberal democratic state and information provided by a ministry controlled by an entity listed as a terrorist group under the Criminal Code of Canada by the Government of Canada?
As I've indicated, we are getting consistent numbers from the Government of Israel. We trust those numbers. We've seen through the media, through other sources in Israel as well, all of the backup that shows this. On the Palestinian side, we are getting these figures from the Ministry of Health, and our experience has been that the Ministry of Health's numbers are usually quite a bit higher than the numbers that we see from other sources on the Palestinian
Thank you.
side.
I'd like to switch topics a bit and talk about evacuations. We all remember the pandemic where millions, hundreds of thousands of Canadians were trapped in an emergency situation abroad. The policy of the Government of Canada at the time, if I recall correctly, was that Canadians had to pay their own way back to Canada. The government would offer emergency loans, but it was expected that those loans would be repaid in full. Recently, the government evacuated a number of Canadians from Tel Aviv to Athens. Who was responsible for the payment of that transit?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So in terms of our policy on evacuations, when we're dealing with a crisis situation, our objective is to get people to a safe country.
Understood.
And so that first piece is the Government of Canada has taken responsibility for that. So that is, in this case, that was done through the Canadian Armed Forces to Athens, at which point individuals are required to pay their onward travel to Canada and also to coordinate their lodging. Of course, our mission helps support getting access to hotels, et cetera.
So why the seeming inconsistency? Because in the early days of a declared global pandemic, many Canadians were trapped abroad, and they were told in no uncertain terms they had to pay for their own flights, and in many cases the flights were very expensive because it was at the last minute. Borders were closing. It was an emergency situation to get back in the weeks following the declaration of a global pandemic on March 11th of 2020. And yet, in other cases, Canadians are not expected to reimburse the Government of Canada. So I'm wondering, it seems to be there's a bit of an inconsistency with the government's policy here.
So what I would say to that, Mr. Chair, is that our policy, as applied to conflict crisis scenarios, has been very consistent. So in the case of Sudan, we took people to Nairobi, at which point for onward travel, they were required to support that travel. Of course, we have funding that's available should anyone require a loan to be able to do that. We have something called the Distressed Canadian Fund.
Understood.
Also
that answers
in
my question. Thank you. That's a good clarification. Thank you. Just a quick question. Do you believe that the government should allow...
Mr. John.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry.